Welcome to our lunch break today by Las Comadres. We at Las Comadres started this project called Lunch Break, where we come every weekday from 12 to 1, and we bring a panel of amazing members of our community of Las Comadres that are experts in what they do, and we talk about things from business to raising kids to managing stress to all things and more. And today we have a very fun topic that we're going to dive into, and a relevant topic, which is called How to Start a Podcast Now. So we have an amazing panel of beautiful women and also very established women in their careers. And I'm going to welcome them by introducing them by their name and what they do. So first we have Jessica Casucci, which is the founder of Mount Olympus Performance Group, an executive and performance coaching for women. In addition to coaching, she can be found sharing inspirational stories of everyday women on her podcast, Boldly Spoken. Then we have Rebecca Portuondo, which is a mother of three, a mental health enthusiast. She started a podcast with her friend a year ago to destigmatize mental health, talk about real issues, and have some laughs along the way. And then we have, last but not least, Virginia Laura. She's an independent audio producer, interviewer, and storyteller who produces shows such as Feeling My Flow, a reported podcast for tweens about all things menstruation, and Writing Class Radio, which is a podcast about memoir writing. So ladies, welcome to the show. So excited to have you.
Hi.
Hello.
Here.
So we always love to start the program by asking our first question at Comadres, which is, what are you grateful for today? So who would like to kick us off?
I can go.
All right, Jessica.
But I'm grateful that every night that I have dinner with 4 members in my family. It reminds me of when I was growing up as a little kid, and it reminds me of my great-grandparents, and gives me a great sense of home during all this and family. And really long walks by myself that I can still do at this park by my house where there's beautiful trees and nobody's outside, and it gives me a sense of connection to nature. So I'm really grateful for that today.
Nice, thank you.
I
would just, I'm really grateful for my health. I guess that right now I'm thinking about that a lot, and I'm just happy that we're healthy and that, you know, everybody's healthy in my family and nobody's gotten, you know, sick yet. I'm sure once things open, you know, people will start getting sick, but for now, I'm happy that everybody's safe and healthy.
Yeah. And I'm really grateful for things like the internet and things that something that I've definitely taken for granted. And I have family all over the US and back in Peru. And so we've been able to do things like we've always used the internet to communicate, but we've done a lot more of that lately. And I just keep thinking about how different things would be if we were going through this in a pre-internet era. That's been like really present in my mind right now. So I'm grateful for that, for the connection it allows.
Yeah. And for those out there who will be seeing this in the future, right now, we are in the midst of a global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of us are home right now, self-isolating to pitch into our communities and support the effort. And so, yeah, this connection of internet and of us being able to be on this panel today and share whatever wisdom we can to support viewers out there is super, super relevant right now. So I thank you, ladies. And I'm grateful for you guys for being here. So let's dive in, shall we? This is a super interesting topic because I personally want to start a podcast. So this is going to be like an amazing experience for me personally. But, you know, the podcast industry is geared to be a $1 billion industry by 2021. It's growing exponentially. And it's oftentimes a lot of people think, you know, it's probably like too techy or too overwhelming to understand. And so we brought you guys today because you guys are experts in this. You guys have done it yourselves. You guys know the ins and outs. And so I want to start with just like an overall question about sharing what podcast you're currently working on, a little bit about it, and then how did you first get into it? Like, what was your first experience considering to get in a podcast, and why?
I mean, I can just speak for myself, I guess. I'm a huge podcast fan. I think some people don't listen to podcasts, but I'm constantly listening to podcasts. And really what started it was I was an 80s baby, and I had anxiety when I was 5. I started suffering from like panic attacks and really difficult. And when my mom took me to multiple doctors, there was no information on it because at the time there was not a lot of diagnosis of general anxiety, of panic attack disorder, of different things. So I pretty much had to claw my way for many, many years as I got older and research myself and sort of find therapists and help myself to get to where I am today. And I just figured, what other way really to be a facilitator, you know, for people to go somewhere and listen and have resources. We laugh a lot, we crack jokes, we sort of like deflate the balloon, because when you're going through mental health issues, the balloon is very full. So it's like we bring a lot of laughter and we talk about other issues. We've realized like marriage and divorce and raising kids. We pretty much don't shy away from very difficult topics. And it's really resonated in a community where a lot of people, when I first started it, told me not to do it. And they said that I was going to get judged for it, not to talk about those things, that I had to drop off my kids at school, that it was going to be a problem. And I got a lot of pushback. And I think if you want to start a podcast, you got to get over that and you just got to do it. And really the feedback has been incredible. Like, so I think it's very easy to do. I'm sure we'll talk about the way to do it. It's very easy to start. I'm not a techie person. But I think if you have a passion about a subject and really want to help people or just guide people or talk about anything, really, you can talk about anything. I mean, there's podcasts on Friends episodes. There's podcasts on Star Trek. I mean, you could talk about, there's niches for everybody out there. You got to get over what people might say or think, because then you start censoring yourself on your own podcast. And you don't want to do that. I think what resonates is we don't censor ourselves. We say what we got to say, good or bad. And I think that's what's resonated. And that's why we have so many moms listening and so many young girls in college who are struggling with mental health, keeping it a secret and doing things sometimes to self-harm because they don't see a way out. And when they go to their parents are like, you're fine, you're just stressed, you're okay, you're fine. And I don't want people to go through that, because I went through that for maybe 20 years of my life. So yeah, that's why.
You know, to add on to what Rebecca said, so I guess mine started off a little differently. I had I'm 45 now, and I decided, well, certain things happened in my life that I basically blew it up, metaphorically. I left a very lucrative career. There was a lot of things that happened. And I had no role models of people who, whether late 30s to 50s, just decided to completely, change their life in a different way. And I started off by just talking to people. I made myself like a research project. I was on sabbatical, and I'm obviously not afraid to talk because I was an attorney for 20 years. But before I was 5 years old, I had a big mouth, right? So I started interviewing some people I knew, and then I got referred to somebody else because I was looking for a mentor and guidance of how to make a big pivot. And I was in a position where it was the first time in my life that I could make decisions just based on me. in a very privileged position. Like I didn't have to worry about my parents. I didn't have to worry about kids. I didn't have to worry about a boss, a husband, anything. And I had never in my entire life was like that. Even when I went to law school, it was more, I was thinking about my family. I was thinking about everything else. And then I said, I just want to hear some people who had done it. And so the podcast started off because I got so inspired by some of these other women that I spoke to. And everyone had these amazing stories of whether it was diversity or change or things that I would have never expected in their life. Like I knew them now, or if I knew them or a friend of theirs, but there was always something in there. And it started snowballing. And I named the podcast Boldly Spoken because I wanted to share inspiring stories of women doing bold, brave, and badass things. Because so much of the time, especially women's stories, we don't get to hear them and we don't get to share them. And I did it also because I felt like it was my way of giving back. We highlight a charity every episode too, to create awareness and to give back to the community, whether you can do time, talent, or treasure. I said, I have this voice. My grandmother always kind of instilled in me, like, you have this voice in you. And it was the first time that I felt like I was doing something good with it. I wasn't, no offense to what I was doing before. It paid the bills and did everything else. But, you know, I always say I was just playing with rich people's money, which did what it needed to do. But this, I feel like, it's the first time that I'm using my voice to help others. And maybe it's because of some of the things I went through, but every day, on my worst day, there's something in one of these interviews that makes me smile. And like Rebecca was saying, you know, there's things that I have said about my life that are now public that probably a lot of people think I'm crazy for putting out there or sharing, and it's bit by bit. But every message I get is like, I heard this, or my friend heard this, and you don't know how much this helped me today. Hi, Bird. We get nature in the house. But I don't know. I felt like more women, like Rebecca was saying, like we all go through struggles, and to hear you coming out the other side, we need that. We need that not every day, but now more than ever. And that's kind of the why for me.
Virginia?
Yeah. So I came to audio work and radio because I think by accident a few years ago. So it's a career change for me also. And I think I gravitated to it because growing up, I loved doing art, like drawing and painting and like creating that. And I remember at some point as a little kid thinking, you know, as an older kid thinking like, can somebody make a career? Can I make a career out of this? And I think at that point I was like, no, I don't think I can do that. But there was always this question in my head too about like, what is this for? And of course now as an adult, I could give myself an answer about like the why of art and how important it is. But at that point, it was something that I just had no answer for. But then later, as a young adult person, I thought, let me think about journalism, right? And so I became interested in the idea of journalism and sharing, like sort of for the idea of connecting with people and hearing people's stories, but also for the idea of like, this is for the public good. And by accident, a few years ago, I had the realization that radio storytelling was a really beautiful way of merging those two things, where that's sort of a lot of the podcasts that I've worked on tell true personal stories. And so, but it allows me to do it in a creative way, in a way that not only is it providing information, but it's doing so in a way that a listener is engaged and wants to listen. So I weave a lot of like storytelling into my work, but it was a good balance of making me feel like this is important information, and I'm not going to serve it up as broccoli that nobody wants to get through, but I'm going to figure out like, how do I make it engaging? What kind of questions do you need to ask, or how do I need to shape, you know, to put that out there so that people want to come back to it. yeah, so for me, it was just sort of a really happy medium of bringing these two interests together. Um, I I gravitated more towards it because of the form um, than the content, although like I am really interested in specific conversations, right? But I loved the podcast, like the medium of podcasting because of the platform, because of what you've said, both Jessica and Rebecca, about how it's really like a great platform that makes it allows people to put their stories out there. Um, and I started also like as an interviewer. And so I often encountered people. I worked for an oral history project early on when I started getting into radio and audio. And so it was a project that interviewed regular everyday people, in quotations, and people would often say like, oh, I don't have anything to say, I don't have a story to share, but you should really interview my grandmother, or you should really talk to my best friend or my teacher. But I found that if I actually got down and sat with those people, they would say things out of their mouths and like that would just blow you away. And I remember always thinking like, you thought you had nothing to say? Like, really? And
Yeah.
for like podcasting, it makes it so much more accessible for people who may not have thought that before. And then it helps people like realize like, actually what I do say is valuable, and I do have something that can be of value for someone else. So that's sort of the why I keep staying in this world.
Cool. Awesome. So why do you guys think, you talked about a little bit about why you got into it and why it's important to you. And Rebecca mentioned a couple of things of like why everyone should do it. And that kind of leads us into the next question, which is why is it important for someone to start a podcast if they're thinking about it?
I think,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I think because you will never know if it's for you until you try it. I think if it's something that you're thinking about, I think you really, there's only so much you can read, so much you can talk to people, so much you can prepare before you actually do the thing. Make maybe a pilot. I always talk to people who are thinking about it and say like, plan to make a pilot. And then you can decide if you actually want to make a show, because you don't even know what you're talking about until you actually do the thing. Like what if you do it and it's beautiful, but you hate it every step of the process? Then it's like not your thing. Then you figure something else out. Or what if, and then that's sort of why I'm saying like it's important to start, because you won't know if it's for you until you've actually gone through the process.
Mm.
And also just letting people know, like, listen, you're going to start and your first couple of episodes probably won't be that great. Just get over it. The more you practice, the more you do, the more you talk, the more comfortable you get on the mic. There is a response in the human body that when you turn on that mic, you get a little bit nervous, like, ooh, and you have to get real comfortable with it. So it's a process. Like people think that you have to put out this beautiful finished product from the beginning. Podcasting is a process. It's spontaneous. You might start off a conversation thinking in your head, you have an outline, a paper, thinking it's going to go a certain way. And dude, it goes a totally different direction and it ends up being better than you even thought. So podcasting has a lot of spontaneity. The best podcasts like Brene Brown, Joe Rogan, people that are like at the top of their game are very spontaneous. Mm-hmm. So you have to also allow for the spontaneity of the conversation sometimes. I'm not saying all podcasts, but it doesn't have to be perfect. Just try it and keep going. If you like it, keep practicing content once a week and you're going to tweak it here or there. So there's a lot of that. Like, don't be so hard on yourself or overthink it, because you won't put it live. You'll get too nervous that people will pick it apart. Like just do it. Put it out there.
That's like your first kiss. That's like your first kiss. You're nervous, you're excited. Just go for it. You're going to get better. It'll be okay. I don't know. That's what I was thinking about listening to everybody else. And then Virginia even said the thing, you might do it and it might come out great, but you might hate the process of it, right? And so I kind of wanted to add on that is, you know, one of the first things that I learned, you know, I was trying when I first started to do everything myself. And besides not having patience for all that or that many hours in the day, I realized like editing was never going to be for me. Like it wasn't, and you know, we can start, and that's not the way everybody wants to go, but I really enjoyed the other part. I actually thought the editing part was going to be easier for me because I'm just listening. I'm, you know, I'm editing for content. I'm editing for sounds. I'm like, oh, this is going to be the easy peasy thing. This will address my like a little analytical lawyer brain, right? So you don't know what parts you're going to enjoy until you try and go through it all, you know, until you try all the little pieces. And there might be something you might do a pilot, like Virginia was saying, or even a season of one show and then say, no, now I'm going to flip it and do something else. Another great thing about the medium is it's very easy to create and it's very easy to pivot and morph and change and try out new things. And even now I'm thinking, you know, I might have had X number of interviews completely lined up from here until September. They were already recorded in the can. Well, you know, there's a lot of different stuff, I'm editing myself, going on in the world right now. So maybe let me do a few things. It's a very flexible medium too. So you can play around with a few different things until you get comfortable. And, you know.
And you don't have to edit. Like we don't edit ours because our conversations get very raw and real. And so there's a lot of times that at first we wanted to edit and we realized it took a lot of like the juice out of our convo. I can't explain it, but we don't edit because our conversations, sometimes people start crying. It gets like, you have to just let it go. And for an hour, it's a conversation. So that also could be, some podcasts are like that where they go live and they don't edit. And that's also something people can do if you want to. There's so many options. Like it's awesome.
Exactly. Like worrying about like the dog bark. Like don't worry about that. That's real life. You know, the bird. There's a kid. Something I've had. You know, something completely crash and fall over, and then I just start laughing. There are days that I forget English and it's my first language. You know, it happens. You just roll with it, and the person on the other end listening knows they're not talking to a robot. Too. They're not. It's podcasts are supposed to be the best podcasts. I think are like having your friend talking to you, or in some case learning from your best teacher, or you know, comfortable like that, and comfortable not in a way that it doesn't challenge the way you think sometimes, but it's human, and humans have flaws, so you kind of push past that and let it be.
To build a little bit on what Jessica said earlier about how it's easy to change and pivot and move things around, it's also why I would say that people who are thinking about a podcast and don't have one yet, they don't have that audience, it's almost like perfect, because then you can do whatever you want and your listenership is still small, right? Nobody has, even if people have an expectation about who you are in other parts of life, like let's say your podcast is like, you know, moving your brand along or promoting a service that you provide, even if it's that, or even if it's a standalone podcast, like people are listening is probably going to be the people that listen are probably going to be close circle of family, friends, or who already love you. So it's almost like you can make the mistakes or like try things out, and then you can decide, okay, totally different thing now that I know what I do it, like this season can be something else. And people, no one's going to come out and say like, oh no, that's not what this podcast was about. That's not what you were about. You have a lot of, it's almost like in anonymity or relative anonymity, you have a lot of freedom to just try different things and like experiment with stuff. So another thing, like that's why I love that idea of starting one soon rather than later. And to add on to what I would say about editing, I guess I am kind of biased because that's a lot of the work that I do. But I think what Rebecca was saying is true in terms of if you know what your podcast is, you know what doesn't belong there, and you can focus any editing on that. And depending on the format, like if you know that your podcast is all about spontaneity and raw, like just raw conversations and things that's happened in the moment, then you know that it's not too, you don't have to worry about what some people might say, like, oh, that's like hard to hear sound, or that's like a long period of laughter or crying. Like, you know that for you, that's actually really valuable. So you are going to leave it there, and you know that you don't need to spend time editing that at all, because you know what you're about and what you're trying to put out there. So I think it's a lot about what it is, what format you want your podcast to take on, and what it is that the mission of the project is. So yeah, you don't, like, editing can be a tool if it serves you, but it's also, it doesn't have to be something that stops you from starting one if you don't know how to edit or can't get someone on your team to edit.
And if there's something that, just one more thing, if there's something that comes up and it's really raw and it's really real, and like you said, it's intrinsic to the podcast, it's intrinsic to that person's story, you can add a tag on in the beginning. You can record, 30 seconds again. Hey, we're going to get into some deep stuff like X, Y, and Z. If you're okay with that today, keep listening. If not, catch us on the next episode, or catch us at this minute mark, because I've had stuff that's come up. We're not PG-13 at all, but there's been some real difficult stuff that's come up, and I've chosen to say, if you need to skip ahead between this minute marker and that one, don't worry, I got you. And that's how I choose to deal with stuff like that. So
amazing. So
and then there's our listeners expect that. So like for us, it's like, if you're tuning in, you're expecting it. Like, what you want to hear is exactly what your mom's not talking to you about, what your friends are scared to admit that's happening to them. And so you're tuning in for that. So So it's like Jessica says, once people get into your podcast, they know what to expect. And so they're tuning in for what you're offering. Yeah, you know what I mean? So
yeah, I think what I'm hearing from all of you guys is that, I think oftentimes we think that a podcast, I guess the audience may not know exactly how a podcast works. So we'll get into that next, like the details and the logistics. But I think we think sometimes like a podcast is going to be like this big arena where there's going to be millions of people listening to us on the first day, and we have to be perfect, And what I'm hearing from you guys is that there is that level of flexibility that you're able to create on the go, and you're able to adjust and pivot as you go along. And so for the audience viewers out there, if you have any questions live, go ahead and send them in the comments, and we'll have everyone answer them here. But if you are listening to this in the future, you can always comment your questions, and we'll get back to you with answers as well from the panelists. So make sure you send your questions in. But I wanted to dive in now into like the how-to, really, because I know you guys were kind of like, we're on the surface of it, but really to get into. So how would someone structure a podcast? Like, just from hearing all of you share, I've noticed that there's a different style for each of you, and each of you have a different like come from and a different way that you go about it. So like, how would you recommend individually, how would you recommend to the audience like how to structure your podcast, and also like where to start? Like, what's the first step to starting one?
Well, we got a laptop. You get a mic. You can get a mic at Best Buy. You connect it to your laptop. If you're going to start putting your content on iTunes, you have to apply through iTunes. It's super easy to do. And then you fill out, if your content's explicit, blah, blah, blah. And then you get a host. You do it through a host called Buzzsprout. This is what I tell people, Google will teach you in an hour of your time how to do a podcast. Where we record, people think you have to get fancy, you have to spend money. I have a pretty large walk-in closet with a lot of clothes. We record in there with 2 chairs and a table because the clothes help with the noise. And we have a rug on the floor. That's where we do it. Closet. Like, you don't have to get fancy. I know people do rent spaces. There are spaces you can rent, but if you don't want to put money into it like that, which we didn't when we were first starting, and then we figured, oh, our listenership kept growing. Why move out of the closet? This seems to be working. And then people got a kick of being in the closet. So people kept saying, can we come to the closet? Like, it became like a thing. So it's very simple. And Google is really the encyclopedia of everything. You really just need a computer, a mic, and a space where this noise won't, bounce off, where you don't hear echo. But it will teach you everything you need to know to start. You need a host, and you pay a monthly fee to host it. And it gives you analytics. It gives you how many people a week. So it's a very simple process. That's why there's, 800,000 podcasts up on iTunes, like 800,000. And I'm sure in the last couple months, much more that people are quarantined. So it's a very, very simple, Google teaches it all. It's really easy.
An alternative to Google, because what I did Google some stuff. I did talk to friends of mine that were podcasters, but I did also take like a starting your own podcast from there's a group called Podcasters Paradise that's right on Facebook, and like the two people that host it have really successful podcasts, and they depending on how you want to do your strategy, like I thought of what I wanted to do, what I want to accomplish. I'm a little methodical and old school with certain things, and so everything from what should your tile look like on iTunes? Like, you don't realize that there are parameters to that, like the color format, what attracts the eye, the size. How do you figure that out? Like, for me, the way my brain works, it was easier. Somebody kind of gave me like step by step over the next 30 days, work on this day, this day, this day, this day, while I was getting in contact with all these people that I was going to interview. I also, so hosting, I host through Libsyn. Again, you get all the stats, you have all that stuff. I get all the permissions to push to all the servers. I created, we created a web page on my company page that's separate and dedicated for the podcast, because part of my thing is also sharing their stories, links to what these women are doing, but the charity. And I wanted to kind of have a way to promote that and have a home base there. But that was part of my strategy, because I thought about how could I do this and have a way for people to get this other knowledge and give back. So I spend a little more time on the notes and the links and stuff like that. And I think, the other stuff that I did also in the beginning to get people comfortable when I started interviewing people that didn't know me, and there weren't that many episodes in yet other than the trailer, I put together a general, I don't follow this now, but, and I, even in the beginning, I might've used 2 or 3 questions, but I said, hey, here are the types of things that I'm probably going to ask you. Here's the interview. For me, I do an interview show. I do some solo episodes. So for me, having the other person be really comfortable was important. So I said, here's what we're going to do. I set aside, I kind of have a pre-interview checklist. So I set off time in the Zoom. I use Zoom to record everything. And we have 15 minutes where we talk, just the 2 of us, getting comfortable, them getting comfortable with me. There are some times where I'm like, okay, can I ask about this, this, and this? Because I even have stuff in my background that I'm almost completely an open book, but there are certain things where I'm just like, no. So I do that on the front end, and then I do it on the back end. That's just like a process that I have to put through, so that in the time when we're interviewing, people can be relaxed and then be totally spontaneous. So for me, having that system set up was super important. But I learned, again, I had a little starting your podcast 30 days. I did what it said, and it was easy. You don't need to be a rocket scientist. Like I said, I could have probably Googled, but I was doing a bunch of other stuff, and I figured, I'm like, you know what? I don't need to, I trust these couple of people because they have very successful podcasts, and this is kind of their side business, teaching other podcasters. So I leveraged it out. The learning.
So what I would say is to think about structuring. So since you guys have covered a lot of the technical stuff, so I would like focus on the structure part of how to make the podcast itself, like what shape you're going to make it. Like, for example, because I think that's really important. Then you decide on a structure, and then you make sure every episode follows that structure if you've already decided that's what you liked. Because we talked earlier about listeners' expectations, and it's not only that people are coming to the show expecting a certain personality, expecting a certain topic to be covered that they've already learned about, but it's almost like as people listen, you're taking them on a journey. And so there has to be, but the most successful podcast, if you want to, you can define success for however you want, but providing those sort of a similar journey or a similar path so that listeners know what to expect. I think that's been really key, at least for the shows that I've worked on. And you can make that through music. Like you have your same intro and outro music, or the same way that you introduce yourself, or the similar way that you introduce your guests, or the similar questions that you talk about. So I think that providing a consistent format is really helpful for your listeners, but I think it also makes you as the producer and the maker able to experiment. It's almost like if you have some restrictions, then you can play around within them with a little more freedom and creativity. So for the show, one of the shows that I work on, it's called Writing Class Radio. And so I'm the audio producer, and then the two hosts are the other producers too. So we always start the same way. There's a sort of a scripted intro that they introduce the show, the name, the tagline, each other. And then the tagline of the show is, it's Writing Class Radio, where they teach people how to write, but then we also share important personal stories, right? And it's supposed to show and talk about the art and heart of storytelling. And the way we formatted is so generally the show starts, then we feature an essay, like a personal essay that's something that a physical writing class has submitted, or sometimes maybe it's a submission from a listener. So the actual writer of the essay will read it and send us the audio of it. So we have that, and there's music within it. So as you're listening to that section, it's almost like you're in that little world and following the character, and there's music coming in. So it's very narrative. And then after that, we usually have an ad. And then after that, the writing class part of the show starts. So either the two hosts will kind of workshop that essay, talk about what they liked and what they didn't like, or sometimes it's an actual group of people, like a class, workshopping that essay. Sometimes it's a brief interview with the actual writer about what it was like to write the essay. And then there's like a writing lesson in there, and then we say goodbye and an outro. So this season, at least, every single episode follows that, like little story, class discussion. And even if in the discussion, a lot of the times the hosts will talk about their personal lives or something that's unrelated to writing, I'm always either pushing them to or trying to get them to come back to a writing lesson, because ultimately that's what the show is about, and that's why people are there. Yes, we care about connection, but like, unless you tell me how this really crazy story that's not about the essay we just read, but it happened to you, unless you somehow connect it back to like, how is that a writing lesson for the listener, then maybe it doesn't, maybe we don't need to spend like 10 minutes out of a 25-minute podcast on that, right? So I think it's useful to think about it that way, like understand the space that you have and understand what are the things you want to include in there, whether it's, okay, we need to spend this time introducing our guests, or we need to spend this time having this discussion on this topic that's central to the show itself. So I think I would encourage people to think about the format that way, and think about the structure and the things that you need to place in that amount of time that you have. And I'm like a visual person, so Yeah, and I think it's so helpful also to do a lot of that on the front end, like as you're planning your episodes, because then you don't really have to do that much editing after or any at all if you were able to get those things in there during your interview. Or you can always like hire someone to do that for you if you know exactly what you want and what directions you need to give them. Yeah, so that's something that I would say.
Wow, yeah, super, super helpful, I think, for viewers out there to get a handle on how to actually do it, how to actually structure it. And you guys talked about different lengths of time. So can a podcast be any length of time? Is there a set like rule that you need to follow, or like, you know, what are the parameters as far as building it out?
I've had episodes, I mean, my trailer episode was probably only like 7 minutes, but I've had episodes that were short and sweet, especially if you want to address something, the solo ones, when it's just me talking, or like I wanted to get something out really quick about like managing anxiety during coronavirus. 10 minutes, you know, I did it, I squeezed it in. And the longest episode I've had was 50 minutes. And that one I did not want to edit. Usually I try to aim for about 30 minutes, because before I was thinking of, I call my avatar, like who's listening to my show. And it's whether you're commuting or you're, you know, working out or whatever in a smaller box. But sometimes things go, like Rebecca was saying, you know, you're in a flow and not conversation, and I don't want to edit out some of the content. So the longest I've had is actually, I think the one that's coming out on Monday is about 50 minutes, but I try and definitely, I keep it shorter than that for me. But that's because I'm trying to think about like what Virginia and Rebecca was saying, like my audience wants and what they're trying to fit into their day. So no, I gave you a long-winded answer. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but that gives us a good idea. So
I would add to that too, that it is a good way of thinking about it in terms of your audience, but you can also think about it as yourself. Like, what do you like and what you don't like as a listener? Because there are no rules. No one's going to, like, iTunes is not going to shut you down, or Apple Podcasts and be like, too long. But as a listener, I definitely have heard a lot of shows where I have thought like, this did not need to be 55 minutes, or this did not need to be an hour and a half. This could have, like, it's almost like if you cut it down and make it small, then you're really leaving the juicy parts there. And so it depends on what you're trying to do. But my personal thought is like, sometimes if you take out all the stuff and you let the true juicy thing shine, it just makes it for a much better show. Especially now, because I think now podcasts are competing not just with other podcasts, and there's a lot more out there than there used to be, but with things like music, or audiobooks. So I think we should be thinking about our avatars, but also, what do you tend to do? Do you really listen? Like, you have to be already very committed to a particular host or a particular show to maybe sit through an hour and a half of it. But like, what if it's a new listenership? If you're still trying to like engage a new audience, like, is that really what they're going to sit through? Maybe, maybe not. And also how much you care, right? I have a friend who's doing a podcast just for family and friends during coronavirus. So just like, can do all these things. You have to know what your show is supposed to be doing. Like, if you're hoping to monetize your podcast, then maybe you make those decisions from a more business standpoint. And maybe you incorporate like, maybe 25 minutes is your spot, because then it leaves you 5 minutes for ads. So it depends on what you're trying to do. But I personally think short and sweet and less fatty is good.
Awesome. And you mentioned monetize, which is going to be my next question. And so for you ladies in your careers, it's a twofold question. So how has having a podcast impacted your career in any way? And also, have you been able to monetize it, or have you chosen not to? Like, what has been your experience with monetizing, or any advice you can give on that?
Rebecca?
We've had we've worked with some mental health I don't want to say companies, I would say more like nonprofits. We have chosen not to monetize, just because in our lives I don't know, we didn't enter it because of that. Maybe one day we'll change our minds, but we have helped them raise money. We've talked about them. So for us, it's just been a choice as of far, just maybe because we have other careers and we don't really need to. So that's just been our personal choice. But I mean, great if people can, want to monetize. And I mean, making money is not a bad thing if you're putting work into something. So I'm not against it. We just haven't gone that route as of now. You never know.
Jessica?
So for me, it's like a little like Rebecca was saying, but with a twist. So I created it with the intention of giving back. I'm luckily in a financial position that I'm okay paying for the hosting and whatever myself. I did have a couple of people talk about sponsoring, but I said donate the money to the charity instead, the charity of the week, or like I have a house charity, but that's my choice to do that. However, I'm not going to lie and say that it hasn't also funneled traffic to me personally. So I do public speaking for other things. I do executive coaching. While the podcast isn't geared towards that, there are sometimes I do talk about, there's an episode on leading in crisis and things like that. So people have approached me for other speaking events because of hearing me for the first time on the podcast, or coming to the website because the podcast has a page over there, and then just looking around and seeing what's going on. So tangentially, yes. But the intention was philanthropic versus capitalistic, which, again, I'm all for making money. It lets me do good things in the world. So you can start monetizing your podcast with as simple as Audible. Audible will act as a sponsor, and you can be an affiliate link for Audible. Pretty much nobody is offended by having Audible as an affiliate link, because there's always somebody that needs a book read to them, a little kid, an old person, anything on any topic. So it's an easy one to say, oh, okay, I can do that. If anybody doesn't know what an affiliate link is, you can promote it. And if people go through your link on your website or someplace else, you get like a certain amount of money or a percentage of sales, or it's a little different depending on who it is. So there's a lot of different ways, and that's kind of a very easy way to monetize, and I've seen people monetize. Another way that people do it is you can advertise for a class. Like I've monetized people's guesting on my podcast for them. So they've created for your listeners, if they want, I'll give them a discount for this thing that I'm doing. If they want to promote something, I like to say, can you do a haircut or something for the people that are listening, or give something back? And so that has led to business for them. So that's kind of how it works with my show.
Yeah. And I think this is also an arena where there's a lot of experimentation and new thinking outside the box. So I usually the podcast that I work for, I haven't been primarily in charge of monetizing it, but I have seen and witnessed the different things that have been going on. So for example, the writing class podcast, again, it's not like making tons of money, but finding different avenues to fund your project that's also kind of in the same mission, and like so that they're intertwined, could be a way of monetizing your podcast or making some money so that you can at least support it and keep it going. For example, the writing class podcast, they teach writing classes and they charge students for it. It used to be physical classes here in Miami that people would show up. Now a lot of it is online, but a portion of the class, of the fee, came to paying for things like the technical issues or paying for their producer, so me. So if you can find little things, like figure out what it is that you want to invest time and energy, and figure out what you can do to like funnel a little money on that. Another thing that people do, and I heard someone talk about this, it's like they had a niche podcast, for example, and so they would go to even like a local physical store now with coronavirus, it might be like difficult, but I'm sure there's like a way you can transfer that online, but they would speak with them, for example, and like maybe it's not the type of store that's going to upfront money for a podcast that they don't know if is anyone even going to listen or no. But then what you do is you give them a promo code, and you said, for anyone who shows up to your store and says they heard about you from my podcast, give them a discount. And then once you've already made that sale, then I'll get a portion of it. So then in theory, at least for that store owner, it's not like a huge commitment, because they're only going to give you a cut of what the money they already made.
Exactly.
So like that's one way of doing it. And you can do that with online businesses, not just physicals. So Patreon is also something people have been using a lot in this space. So yeah, I think I'm not an expert on monetizing, and certainly the advice of people who love podcasting as a platform and an art form is like, don't go into it thinking you're going to make tons of money. Like some people maybe do, in the same way that some people get rich from writing, but most people are there for other reasons. So if the main goal is monetizing, maybe think of a different project and have a podcast that's funded by that other thing. But who knows, things are changing. So
I just thought of another way to look at that question, like what Virginia was saying. Instead of thinking with the focus on monetizing, the inverse. It's always good to think about the inverse. So if you're thinking about, there are expenses involved in a podcast, and they can range depending on what you want to do. You're hosting, who's doing editing, not doing editing, all those things, right? Even, setting everything up, getting the mic, right? Your time is valuable too. And so it's really important, if you're thinking about like the cost of running a podcast and what you're doing, thinking about your time also. And the fact that not everything needs to be done by you if you don't want to. So one of the like, I, going back to something I said in the beginning, you said, I realized that like I wasn't great at like the editing software, and the time it was taking me to master that was something that I would have rather spent on researching guests or becoming a better interviewer. So when you're first starting out, there's like a bunch of tasks to get an episode out. Start thinking about, where you're spending your time and where you're spending your money. There's a lot of great resources, even as simple as Fiverr, that you can get for different things. Like say you do want a little bit of editing or you want this, or somebody can help with a graphic for you if you're not great with creating things like that. Those are things you can say, what is my time worth? Especially if you're home now and you're balancing kids and parents and this and that and washing your hands a billion times and everything else. Like, it's a little bit like time is still, but time is super precious. And it's really important to think about that and be wise with your time and figure out, what are all the things I'm doing, and does it make sense if I should be the one doing all of them? And then you can figure out how to manage the cost of it as well before you're thinking about monetizing, because I think that that's something you have to think about even before you get to the monetization part.
Nice. Yeah. Awesome. And wow, this has been so informative. But with the last 5 minutes we have, I wanted to ask you guys, I think some of you talked about like the listeners and what the listeners are expecting or want, or once they get used to you and things like that. So like, as you guys, as the listeners with podcasts that you listen to, what are some podcasts that have stood out to you, that have made an impact for you, that have inspired you to do what you do? And maybe what are some feedback that you've received about your podcast from listeners? We could dive into that.
I'm looking down at my phone and seeing my list of subscriptions on here. That's why I'm looking down. Sorry. I mean, I'm a news and politics junkie. without going into a political tangent, I think I have 5 different podcasts on that. It's also my preferred way of getting multiple viewpoints, not only in the US, but around the world. It's also, again, I was a lawyer for 20 years. So without going into all the names on that, that's how I digest news. I do it, I get it out in the morning while I'm having my coffee, and I move on for the day. But beyond that, I have everything from, you know, a mythology podcast to I have truth telling with Elizabeth D'Alto and Terry Cole. The Terry Cole show are 2 of my favorites. They feel like I'm talking to old friends. One of them actually has become a good friend of mine now. But it's like having your sister or, you know, an aunt like telling you about life, and very chill and very relaxing. I have language podcasts. I have Coffee Break Italian and Spanish on my phone, so I can always kind of practice. And then a new one that recently came out is called Dare I Say. And maybe it came out last year, and it's by Olivia Wilde. And again, it's like, it was sponsored by Harper's Bazaar. And again, it's like, you know, women's voices. I'm always looking for people who have like these great stories and that you might not know about. And that's where I get that. And the rest is all like hardcore history and politics. I used to listen to Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss a lot, but for me, they run too long for me to digest them in a coherent fashion. So
and I have a lot of different things. I tend to gravitate most to the narrative podcast, but I love the ones that also do the storytelling with news. So The Daily being one of them, and now recently El Hilo, which is in Spanish, from the folks who make another one of my favorite podcasts, which is Radio Ambulante. But I also, one of my favorites right now is a show called By the Book. It is fabulous. It is so, I think, because it's 2 women who basically live their lives for 2 weeks at a time, according to a self-help book, and then they discuss it throughout. But what I love about it is because the format, because they know very clearly, like they give you a summary of the book, they give you their impressions, but they've also recorded themselves as they live their lives doing this, and conversations they have with family members. So you hear little snippets and scenes from their lives, like with their partners and their kid. I don't know if they're kids, but like, and it's all just, it's a really, really fun little journey that like, this is the book, this is the crazy life, this is the discussion and our feedback. And then it's just really fun. And it's almost like a mix of reality TV, except in audio. To me, it seems to be pushing the medium and doing something cool and different. So that's something I would recommend, especially for anyone who likes self-helpy type of stuff anyway. And a lot of the feedback that we've received, I think people really appreciate the moments of tension in the writing class radio in general, but in writing class radio specifically, maybe when the hosts disagree on something and have a little discussion about it, or which are also moments of spontaneity, because it's usually stuff that they didn't plan on bringing up in their discussion, but it just came up and was saved for the episode. And it always surprises me to think, like, it actually is spontaneous, but it took a lot of work to get there. Like, it took a lot of planning for us to allow that conversation to happen and that moment to emerge. Like, they had to have their shit together and know exactly the points they wanted to make and like how they were going to back it up. So like, it's funny to me that like a lot of the spontaneity is this thing that stays in people's minds, but like, and then people often assume like, oh, it's so easy. And you're like, it wasn't actually, but I love you that you enjoyed it. So that's the tidbit.
Yeah, I listened to Goop. I listened to Esther Perel. If you don't, my God, get on it because she's amazing. Super Soul, Second Life. I'm a huge Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan. Even though they can go on for hours, doesn't matter. Like, I'll just listen half an hour, take it out, reconnect. Sometimes it's, you don't have to listen to the whole thing, but I'm a huge fan. And I love Gary Vee. I'm obsessed with him, the Gary Vee experience. Anything social media, if you're looking how to put yourself on there on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. He's the guy. Like, he has a huge media company, and he just gives great advice on it. So I like him a lot. And on feedback on listeners, we get feedback all the time. I've gotten like emails like telling me to go fuck myself, like that, like what I said on kids being woke. I have an issue with that. We went into it and we were laughing and like just like, and girl, I got emails from Ohio State. I got kids who were like that's the fun part. Like, it's like, okay, so then I go into it with them on email where we have a discussion, and you know, you can have, who cares if people disagree? Like, that's the great part. A lot of times me and my co-host disagree. We disagree on issues like marriage. We don't agree. Like, we have very different viewpoints on marriage, on mental health, on meds. Like, who cares? Like, that's what they're there for. She takes meds for her mental health issues. I don't. And so we get into conversations about it, and we back it up with facts, and we have years of therapy behind I think I've been in therapy like 15 years, and read hundreds of anxiety and depression, and so that's also the fun part. You have to be open to people disagreeing, because sometimes you're giving a lot of the times your own opinion, even though you bring knowledge, you back that up with the knowledge you've learned or with some facts. But a lot of people might tell you, like, you're full of shit. I totally disagreed with this episode. But guess what? They're tuning in. They are like, you know what I mean? So you have to be okay with people disagreeing. You're not going to get a bunch of lemmings just like, yeah, this is amazing. You know, right. And when we first started out, I had a girl text me like, dude, your audio sucks. And she was right. I was like, dude, I'm trying to figure it out. And so we reworked the audio. Like, this is all part of it. Like, you know, if you're going to put yourself out on social media or create a podcast, there's always a voice. I always tell people there's a little voice inside you sometimes that says, you're just not good enough, or who really is going to give a shit about what you have to say? And you have to get over that. Like, you're not going to get over the fear of starting it. You just got to start it fearful. And then the more you do it, the less fearful you become. And that's people. And people are like, well, how do you get listeners? Announce it on your social media platforms. If you think about it this way, there's perspective. If you have 20 listeners, let's just say 20 listeners a week, think about those people in real life came to your house and sat around a table and listened to you just talk for an hour and were actually interested. 20 people's a lot. So like I tell people, like, gain perspective. You start off little and then you grow, and that's how, like, relax. Don't focus on the listeners. Focus on giving great content, giving value, and people will come. That people will come. If people feel they're getting value out of what you're saying, they will come. So
amazing. Well, ladies, this has been spectacular. This brings us to the hour. So we're going to wrap it up. You guys have been a plethora of information that I think the audience will really enjoy. And like we said, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and the ladies will be happy to answer. You'll also see their social media links attached to this episode, so you can follow up with them. We at the Comadres, we are supporting our members. And so if you'd like to donate and support us during this time, there's also a link there for that. And we're just super happy and grateful that you guys were able to come on and share your expertise. And we hope everyone goes out and starts a podcast tomorrow.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're bored. Do it.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening, guys. And thank you, ladies, for being a part of this.